So in this video, I'm going to give you a complete system to fix your back pain for good. Yes, I generally mean for good. It'll be fairly simple, however, it won't be easy, but if you follow all the steps in this system, you'll understand your back pain better and therefore be better equipped to solve it and keep it solved for the rest of your life. So the first thing we need to do is have a simple but effective structure that we can use to base our program on. And a good way to start is to have a three stage simple pyramid that we sort of build from one layer to the next, and that kind of forms our program. So the base layer is going to be sort of investigation, understanding our problem, and also what we call aggravators as well. The second layer is going to be strengthening our weaknesses and creating like a level playing field from which we can build in terms of muscular strength. And the top layer is going to be either specialist movement skills or just movement skills and goals that we need to get back to by putting those components from the layer below together. So layer one, investigation and aggravators. So a useful thing to use here is what we call the Punjabi model of spinal stability. And what that model suggests is that we have three subsystems that give us spinal stability and therefore protect us from spinal injury and pain. Now we have a neurological subsystem, a passive subsystem, which would be our bones, discs and ligaments, and then we have an active subsystem, which would be the muscles that kind of combine together, generate what we call core or spinal stability. And all those three systems need to be in balance to protect our spine from damage. If one of those systems becomes faulty, that workload has to go somewhere, and invariably, eventually, it'll end up on the passive subsystem, and it will start to break things down. That's how we start to get things like disc bulges, end plate fractures, stenosis, because that passive system is bearing the brunt of that workload, and the other two subsystems aren't doing their fair share. By far, the most common injury I see is that of disc bulges. So what that basically means is that passive system is bearing the brunt of a high volume of excessive faulty flexion. So flexion is that kind of forward rounding of the lumbar spine. And again, things to keep in mind, like just slipping in and out of flexion isn't going to create damage. But if we have hundreds of cycles or hundreds of loaded faulty cycles of flexion, eventually that hydraulic pressure is going to create that wear and tear on a disc, which in turn begins to form a disc bulge and eventually could become a herniation as well. What that basically means is that for that to happen, we've had to break down our active subsystem, our muscles, to let that excessive workload, then move on to the passive system and let that bear the brunt of that wear and tear. So what we need to do is think of our injury like a bank account. The lower our bank account becomes, the more damage we get and the more pain we get. So if your damage like a disc bulge comes from excessive flexion, every time you slip into flexion, you're going to make a bigger withdrawal on that bank account. Now, for example, that can occur in either movement or our posture habits. And I like to break aggravators down into two types, active and passive. Active ones are generally way more obvious because they usually give you like an instant hit of pain. So for example, if you lift a heavy piece of furniture, you bend a bit awkward to pick up some shopping or something, it could be a pet or a small child, you'll get that little kind of like, catch of pain, and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. The passive ones are a little bit more insidious. That's your posture habits, usually when your mind is elsewhere. So probably the most common, like most people now have a job generally where they sit down for long periods. Now it could be within an office, or it could be, driving a car or a truck or something, going from job to job or client to client to client. Again, if we sit in a way that encourages excessive faulty flexion, every minute you sit there, there's another door of that bank account that's starting to be drained. Or every time we do that awkward big move, that active aggravator, that's like $5 or $10 gone. Now, if we get to the end of the day and we've still got plenty left in the bank account, that's not going to create a problem. However, if the bank account gets to zero, even worse, overdrawn, that's when that brunt of that workload is going to go into that passive system and start to break down that disc and create the disc bulge or the herniation. So what we need to do, the most important thing to do at this investigation stage, is understand the type of damage that you may have got in that passive structure. what are the mechanical forces that would create that damage, and where are those mechanical forces coming from? And again, we need to look at it from active and passive aggravators. So maybe you're in the gym training, and every time you do deadlifts or squats, you get a flare of pain because your technique's faulty for some reason, and you slip into that excessive flexion with that load, and that's enough to create the damage. Or maybe you just have a job where you sit for long periods and you haven't realized that even with your best intentions, if you sit there for long enough and don't move, you tend to slump your posture. And that sort of build-up of hydraulic pressure with that, that flexion during the course of the day slowly drains that bank account, and again, gives you that hit of pain again towards the end of the day where you feel stiff or things feel irritated, or maybe even your sciatica comes back as well. So the most important thing to do, because this is a mistake that most people make with their back rehab, is you need to clearly understand what your aggravators are and identify where they occur, and then think of strategies to start avoiding them, or at least minimizing them, to bring them back down below a tolerable level. Now, passive flexion, especially if you have a sitting job, is pretty easy to avoid. All you need to do is either select a decent chair for you or a sitting option that changes things, or we just have some sort of lumbar support, which could be just as simple as a rolled up towel placed between your lumbar spine and the chair, just to kind of keep you out of that sort of excessive flexion when you sit there for a few hours. And also we can change, rather than being sat still all day, perhaps it's best to break it up. Maybe you can get a standing desk, you can sit for a bit, stand for a bit, and kind of rotate every half an hour or an hour or so to kind of spare that bank account. But again, we must get those aggravators under control and protect that bank account. One big reason to protect that bank account is we have this phenomenon called AMI, or arthrogenic muscular inhibition. So not only when we drain that bank account do we place more stress on that passive structure and potentially damage those discs, for example, in case of a disc bulge, but also with AMI, the arthrogenic muscular inhibition, we start to corrupt our software, our neurological subsystem that controls the active system in terms of which muscles should be helping you to prevent that damage, especially when we're still getting a lot of back pain or catches of pain. That pain physically almost impairs or almost disables some of the muscles you should use in your core, particularly your hips and glutes, that should be bearing the brunt of some of that workload. So again, most important, and it's the biggest mistake that everybody makes, we must get those aggravators under control, let things begin to settle, but also give us a chance then to let that software be in a position where we can start to rewrite it, and we can start to change our movement skills, our movement engrams. But again, it must start with a thorough investigation. What are your aggravators? When do they occur? One way you can do that is we can use McGill's assessments, his provocation tests. That will put, we can use that to put people into different positions that will tell us what sort of mechanical damage is present, but also what a person's aggravators are very clearly. But you need to work with a certified clinician in order to be able to do that. So if you can't do that, you don't have access to a certified McGill practitioner, another way to do it is just to keep a diary and see what the pain patterns are. Like, for example, do you generally feel pretty good in the morning, and as the day goes on you feel worse? That's a good sign you've got those aggravators going on during the course of the day, and as the day goes on you're draining that bank account lower and lower and lower, and that's why your back pain comes on. So if that's the case, have a look at your day to day. Where are the things that occur that make those withdrawals, and what can you do to change those movement and posture habits to make them less expensive? Now what I'll do with this video is I'll put a link either in my newsletter or on the YouTube channel to a very basic sort of pain aggravated diary that you can keep that helps you kind of work out what those patterns are and begins to give you a bit of clarity as to what the things that are kind of irritating your back and draining that bank account, so you can begin to manage it and begin to spare that bank account and give yourself less pain day to day. But again, this is the most important thing to do because it's the base layer of that pyramid. If you don't get the base right, we can't build anything else going upwards because it's going to continually keep crumbling and coming down. Another mistake that people make is once they're out of pain and they're kind of back in the gym or doing exercises, they get complacent with that foundational level, managing those aggravators. And will you believe it, give it enough time, those aggravators come back enough the whole thing will crumble again. You're almost like you're back at square one. So think of that base layer, those aggravators and that investigation, as about setting the rules of the game for you going forward for the rest of your life. If you always adhere to the rules of the game and keep that base foundation layer solid, everything else above it's going to stay solid, and you have far less likely chance of having relapses and having back pain in the future. That's why you want to spend some good quality investigative time on this layer to clearly understand your problem, understand your aggravators, because then that will literally shape your success going forward. Okay, so once we have that foundational layer in place with a solid investigation and an understanding of your aggravators, the trick going forward, once you've got it clearly set, is to maintain it so this next layer is going to be a lot easier and a lot more productive, and you'll actually get better results. So this next layer now is about rewriting or trying to rewrite that corrupted software, those corrupted movement engrams, and control over fundamental muscular skills that you should have. Now, the reason we want to do this is that later on, the bigger, more interesting movements, say for example, deadlifts, kettlebell swings, even things like walking, picking up a basket of washing, picking up kids, playing with the kids, swimming, running, jumping, those more complicated movements require you to put all these little foundational skills together in order to do those movements safely. If any of those little foundational skills are missing or weak or corrupted, there's extra workload that'll go into your back. So that's what we mean by your back is not weak, it is overused. Because any slack in this layer, any little things that aren't quite right, and that workload has to go somewhere, and it will go into your lower back, and your back will start to again feel sore again. But again, at this stage, very important, that you've got that base level solid, so it's easy to rewrite the software at this level. Now, in terms of foundational skills, what do I mean? So, this is where we start to look at things like core stability and core strength. When we do core strength, we basically need to think of three skill sets in kind of three different directions. There's our front to back stability, there's our side to side lateral stability, and then we have rotational transverse stability on top of that. Because anything we do in the real world is some sort of combination of those skills so that we can protect our spine in space and time in 3 dimensions and protect it from any sort of untoward movement that's going to overload that lower back again. So a good place to start for most, not all, but most, is McGill's big 3. So we have the McGill curler, the modified side bridges, and we have the McGill style bird dogs as well. Now what these exercises do, and thanks to research of Professor Stuart McGill, they're basically selected to give us the best balance between risk versus reward. The skill level is relatively low, not none, not non-existent. You do have to work at them, but the return on investment we get if we can master them can be exponential in terms of developing that initial core stability for you and giving you those first layers of armor, those first layers of fundamental skill that we need later on to kind of build into the bigger movements and the goals that you've probably got in terms of either exercising, return to sport, playing with the kids, whatever it may be. And what we need to do is keep a balance between those all 3 skills. So they're all as strong as each other. And again, there's no weak links in the chain that then mean we're going to send work back to the lower back again as it sort of tries to fill in the difference. So again, McGill's Big 3 is a superb start for most people. Sometimes there might be other things we've got to deal with that won't let us use those exercises. For example, if someone's got severe shoulder and neck issues, they might not be able to do a side bridge on the side. We might have to find an alternative exercise from while we work on that shoulder and neck issue so we don't aggravate it. But for most people, they can generally start pretty safe with sort of level 1 side bridges, McGill curls and level 1 bird dogs, and sort of build from there to get those fundamental core skills up to scratch. So one of those fundamental skills that we learn with the McGill curl is that of the brace, being able to use those obliques like a layer of armor to sort of protect our spine from uncontrolled movements. And that skill over time can then be dialed up and sharpened, suitable for the things we want to do. So for example, sort of day-to-day stuff that things are pretty light. If you think of it like idea of a dial, you might need to learn to use that brace at maybe a 3 or 4 out of 10. Picking up baskets of washing, shopping, moving stuff around the kitchen, emptying the dishwasher, in out the car, something like that. If eventually when you get back to things like deadlifts and squats, then you're going to really need to know how to dial it up to a full 10 out of 10 to protect that spine under the duress, the stress of the heavier weights. So the brace again bears the brunt and it protects your lower back. So that's one of the key fundamental skills we learn with the McGill curl, also to extent with the side bridges and the bird dogs, because you need that brace to kind of set itself, and that brace should be engaged the whole time on those 3 exercises. So again, very important to understand the concept of the brace and understand we're not trying to suck the belly button in, we're not pushing the belly button out, we're tensing those obliques, we're learning to fight our fingers and get ourselves nice and tight and strong and sharpen that skill, so anytime we wish, we can dial it up to give us some extra protection. Okay, probably the next biggest fundamental skill is that of the anti-shrug. So a shrug is shoulders to ears using your traps. An anti-shrug, guess what, is pulling the opposite directions. We pull the shoulders down to the hips and engage the lats. The anti-shrug is basically the brace of the upper body, because it will lock down from your midsection all the way to your shoulders and keep that top half of your torso locked in and keep your shoulders and neck safe. So especially when you're trying to lift heavier weights maybe down the track, if you want to do bigger things like squats and deadlifts, pushes and pulls, at some point you need to learn the anti-shrug skill and put that on top of the brace to protect yourself from uncontrolled movements that might irritate either your spine or even your shoulders and your arms and your neck, as things kind of get out of whack on things like bench presses and even push-ups. So again, learning the anti-shrug will protect you, and getting strong at the anti-shrug and getting those muscles in check and getting them strong enough is going to give you naturally a much better posture, which in turn gives you more healthy, stable shoulders, elbows and wrists, and also generally a much better neck posture, particularly if you tend to get things like migraines and neck issues. Having that stable foundation for the neck to work from is going to give you a lot less stress going forward. So again, think of the anti-shrug as the brace of the upper body. You put the brace and the anti-shrug together, like it's pretty impossible to get yourself into a bad position with your spine, because those muscles, those skills won't let you. So that's something else you need to add on, is understanding the anti-shrug. Get a clear idea of the brace, very clear idea of the anti-shrug, and learn to sharpen those skills with things like the McGill Big 3. Okay, next most important thing on that fundamental skill list in that second layer is hip stability and control. So what we mean by that really is basically glute control. So, we're designed as hunter-gatherers. We've probably evolved to do at least 20 to 40, if not 50,000 steps a day looking for food or hunting food. We're lucky these days, average person, it's probably a stretch for them to do like 5,000 steps a day. So why is that important? Because the glute is a very important muscle for our movement, particularly walking. When the glute's working well, our walking gait is very energy efficient, very kind of loose, and it conserves a lot of energy. But also that glute pulls that femur into the socket and helps protect our hip from even wear and tear, and also stabilizes our femur so that we can protect our knees as well and our ankles. So very important those glutes are strong and they are stabilizing those hips for us. So a good place to start is with like fundamental exercises, such simple things such as either seated or lying band pull aparts, and then eventually we can add in slightly more complicated things like banded glute bridges. So again, we learn to control those glutes and its fundamental skills. So that's external rotation, abduction, and hip extension. So I want those glutes in control of those hips. The better the hips work, guess what? The less work your lower back has to do. So again, that's the next thing on the shopping list, is making sure we've got good, solid, strong glute control, and they can help us and take as much work off that lower back as possible. The third stage, so kind of movement skills, movement goals, or specialist skills that you might need. So as a reminder, we have the base level in the control, we understand what causes you pain, we have those aggravators, both passive and active, under control to stop those uncontrolled bursts of pain and drain that bank account. We should now already as well have a solid foundation of those fundamental movement skills. So again, core or spinal stability in 3 directions, so front to back, side to side, and rotational. So again, McGill's big three. If you do a good job at them, that will cover that base for you. We understand how to use the brace and the anti-shrug, even in day-to-day tasks, help give us some stability. We have some good glute and hip control. So our hips are making our femur stable, making our pelvis and hips stable, and give us a solid foundation for our spine, our core to work from. And also we've learned to develop that anti-shrug even more with basic shoulder movement with things like Dr. Locke's big 2 and 3. Now, why is that all important? Because all of those skills, to some degree, we need to put them together at this stage here for these bigger, more interesting, more useful movements. So for example, squats are a good example. To be able to do a good squat, we must have solid brace, a bit of anti-shrug, and good glute engagement all the way down so we don't roll into knee valgus where our knees come in and we can endanger our knees, hips and lower back. We want all those three units to work together to keep us stable, but also if we are stable, we're more efficient. And if we're more efficient, we get better performance. If we get better performance, we can get stronger. So again, there's a big correlation between, or a big overlap between rehab and performance because they're basically the same thing. And that's just trying to make things do the job they're supposed to do. When they all work together, that's our best chance to A, minimize injury, and B, actually get stronger and perform better. So again, this, that fundamental skill layer might be stuff that seems boring, or it might seem like I don't really need to do this, but the better you get those fundamental skills, the higher performance will be in these bigger movements, whatever it may be. It might be stuff in the gym like squats and deadlifts, or it might be the ability to run or to jump or swim or do anything that you need to do. It needs a combination of those skills all together. And we can also think of things here at this level as like working your way through a skill tree. So what's an example of a skill tree? So for example, hip extension. So in order for us to do, say, a kettlebell swing or a deadlift safely, we must have excellence in the execution of hip extension. The ability to start with our hips set with our glutes and drive our hips forward so that we can stand up straight against a load or a weight. So if we look at the case of a deadlift, we need to have that ability to drive those hips up. So what would be a good skill tree to understand how this works together? So for example, going back down a level, you might start with things like, glute squeezes and basic glute bridges to get that basic control. Then we might look at something like a kettlebell RDL or a dumbbell RDL to kind of start building those skills together again, starting to learn how to use the anti-shrug and the brace on top of that hip extension. Once we have that hip hinge excellence with remaining deadlifts, the RDLs, we can then look at safely either go back to deadlifts or into more dynamic things such as kettlebell swings as well. But again, we've had to work our way up that skill list and we've had to have those fundamental skills in place first in order to work our way up that complexity, that increase in skill safely. If we don't do that, and that's quite often what a lot of people do, their back will feel better and they'll generally go back to these higher skills without having kind of worked their way up the skill tree. And again, lo and behold, because you're missing a fundamental skill somewhere and you've gone too high too soon, your back has to fill in the difference. And that's when you're going to blow your back out again. That's why a lot of people get stuck on an endless cycle of, I go to the gym, I train pretty hard, I go to my sport, I'm training pretty hard, I feel pretty good, and then the back starts to deplete again, I get an injury, I rest for a bit, I go back in again, and the cycle starts. Again, it's because you're not working your way methodically up that skill tree, that skill competency, to get back to those higher skills safely in a way that isn't going to expose your lower back. So again, start thinking those bigger movements as skill trees, and you need to work your way up level by level to keep yourself safe, but also to perform better as well. And if you're methodical with it, then you can safely get back to your sport, you can safely get back to regular exercise and not keep re-injuring yourself. So there we have it, a complete system that you can use to not only solve your back pain, but keep your back pain free for the rest of your life. And again, like I said at the start, it's simple, but it's not easy. But again, if you're methodical and you follow that plan, do everything correctly at each stage, a pain-free back will be yours, and if you maintain it, a pain-free back will be yours for life. Now, if that all sounds a bit too complicated and you need a bit of help, I do offer online programs, online coaching, and also in-person coaching in Brisbane as well. And I'll literally take you through that system and help you understand it. Because again, it all begins with understand your specific problem and your aggravators, get those under control, that stops the back pain, and then understand what your weaknesses are that we need to build, and then build yourself back into the movement skills and goals that you need to get back to. But again, you've got to follow that structure, and you've got to understand your problem crystal clear. So again, you can set the rules of the game for yourself going forward and keep yourself out of mischief for the rest of your life. So again, if you need help, I'll put a link down in YouTube, or if you're watching this in the newsletter, there'll be links below to all those programs. So online programs, online coaching, and in-person coaching in Brisbane as well.